Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. We're going to continue our lecture today talking about the ACT and how to do the best you can on the science portion specifically. So last time I saw y'all, we took the ACT science portion and then we looked at the key and marked up which ones we got right and which ones we got wrong. Over the next 6 class periods, what I want to do is take each of those passages and break them down, look at the questions that go along with them, and talk about how we could have gotten the correct answer. Okay? I really want y'all to pay attention this first lesson or two because I'm going to be doing a lot of the work on the front end, but as we get into this and do it more and more, I'm going to be passing that responsibility on to you, and you are going to be doing more of this work. So make sure you're following along today, and let's go ahead and get the ball rolling. So here's what I want to do. We're going to review the practice test. We're going to go through each question. Again, we're going to break this up by the passage. So today we're just going to do passage 1. The next time I see y'all, we'll do passage 2. And then the next day is passage 3. We'll just do one passage each day. Okay, what I want to do is we're going to explain how we got to the correct answer. And then when y'all are doing this on your own, you'll do the same steps, but you'll also talk about why you think you got them wrong, okay? And I'll give you more explanation and more directions as we get there today. So today, our main goal, we're looking at passage 1. We're going to look at the questions that go along with it and talk about how we got to the correct answer. So let's go ahead and get started. So you might remember, here's the passage that you read. This was the Conflicting Viewpoints. It's got 3 scientists here, and they all have a different idea on how these rocks are moving through the playa. Okay, so here's the first question. It says, according to scientist 2, friction between the rocks and the clay is reduced by which of the following? And those are our different answer choices. Okay, well, the correct answer here is D, mud and algae only. This question requires careful reading of the passages. In the paragraph explaining scientist 2's views, it mentions the presence of mud and algae helps reduce the friction between the rocks and the clay. You can kind of see it there. It's about halfway through the passage, okay? Thus, the key information points to the fact that both mud and algae are responsible for reducing the friction. Therefore, D, mud and algae only, is the correct answer. It refers to the materials mentioned by scientist 2. So this one is just very careful reading, okay? It does tell us in the question where to read. It said according to scientist 2. So when you see that, don't waste your time by reading scientist 1 and scientist 3's explanation. It's telling us exactly where to go. And you can see that it's almost verbatim in the passage. So that just requires careful reading to get the correct answer. Okay, here's the next one. It says, suppose a researcher observes that wind speeds greater than 80 miles per hour are needed to move the rocks in the playa. This observation is consistent with which of the following scientists' explanation? Okay, and those are our answer choices right there. Well, the correct answer is H, scientists 2 and 3 only. This question evaluates your ability to compare the scientists' views. Scientist 1 mentions that even light winds can push rocks. Scientist 2 argues that relatively strong winds are required to push the rocks, and Scientist 3 explains that the rocks move only a short distance due to tectonic plates and strong winds. Both Scientist 2 and 3 indicate that strong winds over 80 miles per hour are necessary to move the rocks. Therefore, the correct answer is H, as only Scientist 2 and 3 suggest strong winds are needed. So this one's a little bit harder to answer because you had to go through and read all 3 of those passages in order to find what their opinions are. So one thing you can do, and I'll give you some examples of this as we move through this whole unit, is as we're reading the conflicting viewpoints, what we want to do is something called annotating. Is if we're reading over these passages and we can mark up what the similarities are and what the difference are in between their viewpoint, that would help us save time because then we're not having to go back and reread this stuff. Okay, but according to the passages that we have here, it's only scientist 2 and scientist 3 that are going to fit this explanation. Okay, let's keep it going. So here's question 3. Suppose that no seismic activity was recorded in the playa where the trails left by the rocks are found. This finding would weaken which of the scientists' explanations? And those are our different answer choices. So the correct answer here is B, scientist 3 only. This question focuses on identifying key elements in each scientist's explanation. Out of all the scientists, only scientist 3 proposes that the movement of rocks is due to tectonic plate activity. Therefore, any evidence that shows no seismic activity would contradict this theory, undermining the explanation offered by scientist 3. This is why the correct answer is B, as it only affects the explanation of scientist 3. So again, if we're reading through this conflicting viewpoint passage, if we're annotating it and marking up how the views are similar and different, that would save us a little bit of time when we get to this question, so we don't have to reread all of it. One key piece of information I gave y'all before you took the test was that sometimes it's just best to skip this one because it takes so long. And you might be seeing now that this one is very labor intensive. It takes a lot of the time up out of your ACT time because you have to read this very carefully in order to find how all their viewpoints are similar and different from one another. All right, here's the next one. Let's go ahead and read the question. This says, suppose it was discovered that a particular rock formed a 200-meter long trail in 72 hours. Would this discovery support scientist 1's explanation? Okay, so the answer choice here is G. Yes, scientist 1 indicated the rocks can move several hundred meters in a day. This question examines your ability to interpret scientist 1's explanation. According to scientist 1, a combination of ice, mud, and light winds can cause rocks to move several hundred meters within a short period. Evidence showing that a rock moved 200 meters over 72 hours or 3 days aligns with this explanation. Therefore, the correct answer is G, since it matches scientist 1's claim about the potential distance rocks can move in a few days. So again, this one is almost verbatim out of the passage. You just have to read it very, very carefully. It's saying all 3 of these things can cause the rock to move very quickly. So that's why this is our best answer choice. Okay, here's the next one. So 5 says, suppose that during 1 year there was no measurable movement of any rocks in the playa during the spring. Scientist 1 and scientist 2 would both likely agree that this was due to the absence of which of the following factors. Those are our answer choices. The correct answer here is B, snowmelt. This question asks you to find similarities between the explanations from scientist 1 and scientist 2. Scientist 1 explains that snowmelt from the mountain flows downhill and gathers in the playa, triggering rock movement. Similarly, scientist 2 mentions that snowmelt from the mountains collects in the playa during the spring, making the surface wet, which is key to the rock's movement. Both scientists attribute the initial rock movement to snowmelt. Therefore, if there was no rock movement, both would conclude that the snowmelt was absent, making the correct answer C, snowmelt. Again, this is one of those examples that if we're going through this passage, this conflicting viewpoints, if we're marking up how they're similar and how they're different, we wouldn't have to go back and reread this part because you can see that the snowmelt is mentioned in both of them, and that's how we got to letter B on that one. All right, we got a couple more for this passage, so just hang in there with me. Here's question 6. It says, suppose that air temperature in the playa varies between 4 degrees Celsius and 47 degrees Celsius. Would this information support the explanation of scientist 2? Those are our answer choices, but we should have gone with F. Yes, because ice cannot form in the temperature range. This question tests your knowledge of water's freezing point and its relationship to the given temperatures. Since the air temperature in the playa ranges between 4 degrees Celsius and 47 degrees Celsius, it's clear that water will remain in its liquid state because water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Scientist 2 mentions that the temperature in the playa does not get cold enough for ice to form, which aligns with the temperature range provided. Thus, the temperature conditions would prevent ice formation, supporting the claim from scientist 2. So this one is one of the few examples of where you are going to need a little bit of outside knowledge in order to answer the question. If you read through this passage anywhere, it doesn't give you the freezing point of water. That's just something they're expecting you to know. They're expecting you know that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. It's not written in the passage anywhere. So sometimes people say the science test has no science in it. It's all about reading graphs. But you can see from this question that if you didn't have that piece of information, if you just didn't know that before you took the test, you wouldn't have been able to answer this correctly. Now, you do need to refer back to the passage and find the key information here, but regardless, if you didn't know what the freezing point of water was, you weren't going to be able to answer this question correctly. Okay? All right, here's our last question for the first passage. Question 7 asks, based on Scientist 1's explanations, a rock trail that is 33 centimeters wide was most likely made by a rock with approximately what width? So we have a little bit of math to do here. Here are our different answer choices. The correct answer is C, 50 centimeters. This question tests your ability to use the mathematical relationships described in the passage. Scientist 1 explains that the trail made by the rock is only 2/3 the width of the rocks themselves. If the trail is measured to be 33 centimeters wide, the width of the rock can be calculated as 3/2 times 33 centimeters, which equals 49.5 centimeters, which rounds up to about 50 centimeters. Thus, the rock itself would be approximately 50 centimeters wide. One little hint I would give you here is that, remember, during the science passage, during the science section of the ACT, you do not have a calculator, and the time constraints are the biggest factor here that's going to keep your score really high or really low. So sometimes it's okay to just round up to make the math a little bit easier. Usually you're not going to have to be that specific. They know you don't have a calculator. It's more about doing this very, very quickly in your head. In the question, it says 33 meters. Scientist 1 gives us this fraction that about how the rocks and the trail, what the relationship in between their size are, so we can use that to figure out what the size of the rock was using that information. All right, y'all, so that is passage 1. I wanted to make sure we went through and broke that down question by question so that we could see how we got to the correct answer. As we move through these lessons, y'all are going to be doing more of this work. So thank you so much for following along, and I hope you have a great day.